Did you know that the last recorded Victorian in the British Empire, or former British Empire, died in 2017? Jamaican Violet Brown was born in March 1900 and died in September 2017. That's not that long ago. The last recorded Victorian who died in Britain, Ethel Lang, born May 1900, died January 2015. 2015 she died. It's not long at all. It's in living memory for most of us. Hello everybody, welcome to and welcome back to my channel Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark, and I hope ever so much you're doing well. And I want to talk to you today about why I think the Victorians matter. Now, it's very easy to write them off. They're often written off for being, archaic and racist and having terrible values and being problematic. And yes, of course, a lot of those points are valid to some degree. Not everybody, I'm sure, was a rabid racist running around, saying horrible things about people of other cultures and other races. And besides, also, I think a lot of that may have been due to kind of perhaps the naivety or just prevailing attitudes of the time, that they weren't able to necessarily understand the world in exactly the same way that we are now. But I'm not going to talk about all that, right? I want to talk about how the impact, rightly or wrongly, good and bad, of the Victorians is so strong, even with us today, to the point where events like Victober are actually very important and special events that should be embraced by lots of people. Now, Victober, of course, is a reading event held in the month of October, and it's organized by a wonderful range of hosts, all of whom I shall leave down below. Now, again, I'm not sure I'm taking part necessarily in Victober, because I do read a lot of Victorian works throughout the year. I'll probably read something anyway and therefore take part by default. But I think when you look back and see that the last Victorian died 6 years ago, then you can see that it isn't as removed from us today as we might think so, and therefore it's relevant. I mean, a lot of us on BookTube will have known people born in the 19th century. If you're British, of course, or in former parts of the British Empire, then you would have known genuine Victorians. I know at least two. I knew my great-grandmother before she died in age of 99 in 1987. I knew my grandfather's aunt, who lived with my grandparents. She was born in 1892. Both of whom were Victorians, both of whom I can remember clearly as a child. So I had, contact with them. I mean, if you're older than me, then you absolutely would have known some Victorians. Some of you may even still be, of an age where your own grandparents were Victorians rather than great-grandparents. I doubt there's too many of you out there watching whose parents were Victorian. Unless, of course, you're John Major, and that's an interesting, the former British Prime Minister, John Major, and that's interesting in a sense. I believe his own father was something like 60 when he was born, and born in something like the 1870s, I believe. I can't remember exactly, but it's worth looking up, and it's quite interesting. So they're not that far removed from our lives. And I think that's why, it's extremely interesting. And it's an era, of course, where just so much happened. If we take the literature angle, when you go from the likes of Thackeray and Dickens through to Conan Doyle and H.G. Wells, I mean, there's a big difference in all encompassed within that era. You have the technological advances, of course. The Victorians are the first people to put down undersea cables between Britain and America, which, of course, if you're watching this in America Now that's kind of how you're getting it. Of course, they weren't fiber optic cables, but still, it's an incredible thing to think of. That they really laid the foundations and had such an impact on the world in which we live in. Other scientific discoveries from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, Ada Lovelace's work with computers. I mean, I can go on and on, and all sorts of things, are extremely important and have shaped our lives today. And of course, the Victorian era begins in a Britain and a British Empire that has abolished both the slave trade and slavery itself. So it's kind of a new thing in terms of the world, in how slavery had always existed, but in the Victorian era, it's the first era in British history where slavery doesn't exist. Which is also extremely interesting. Now, of course, you can argue as well that the theories like Darwin's theory of evolution does give rise to distasteful racial theories and social Darwinism, eugenics, and that kind of thing, which of course are abhorrent, though also they can be a case of just people, it's easy for us to say these things are really terrible and horrible, but I'm not sure they didn't know then, right? It's a way of them, of course it's later, manipulated for evil ends, but the original progenitors of these theories, they probably just were hypothesizing, things about the world and trying to understand it. I mean, there's a lot of that going on throughout the Victorian era, and of course their impact through to being both the soldiers and the officers of the First World War, primarily being the senior officers of the Second World War. Britain was led through the Second World War by a Victorian. Older members of the government, right through the 1950s, were still Victorians. Which is extremely, again, which demonstrates clearly again the the impact that they have on the world. And what happened, in the second half of the 20th century, and that's why I think it's relevant that we read works by Victorians, good things and bad things, because if we don't look at the bad things that Victorians wrote about, or the bad ideas that they had, how are we going to learn? We need to take those things to be able to move forward and learn. It's like the horrible racial language used in a lot of Victorian works. If you remove it, you don't know that period was bad, then, do you? If you leave it in there, then you can see how we've kind of progressed, or I like to think that we've progressed in terms of our attitudes to things now. The literature and, of course, the non-fiction of the Victorian world is a window back into that past, a window and a link to that past that links us with people who grew up in that time that we, as I say, would have known personally. Gives us an understanding of how, to some degree, the world in which we live in came to be, and I think that's very important. And it's as good a reason as any to take part in events like Victober, so you can read the words of these people and see and understand the world in which they live, and by kind of default, the world in which we live. So give it a go. I'd like to thank, as usual, my wonderful patrons for their support. It's extremely appreciated, and I am very much overwhelmed by their generous support. And should you wish to join them, you may do so. All relevant links are down below. Thank you ever so much for watching. Do have a great day, and I shall see you all again soon. Bye bye.